I got a Bible. One thing I knew is that from what I remembered from my education in the Catholic Church, God, according to the Catholic Church, was this old man with a beard, you know, sitting on a throne somewhere, and with a pair of binoculars and a 2x4, and every time you screwed up, it just hit you behind the head, right? So, you know, I was kind of terrified of that God very early in my life. And, you know, there was a lot of things about being afraid of God and all this stuff. So when I started my research, I was kind of surprised to find that actually the throne of God in Judaic tradition is not described as an old man with a beard sitting in a throne, but actually as a throne with a tetrahedron on it. And I thought, whoa, that's different. And then, you know, there was like 7 angels, you know, radiating into that tetrahedron. You got to realize as well that I didn't have time to talk about that much today. Actually, today my presentation has been a little bit all over the place. But, you know, I kind of improvise every time because there's so much material. But one thing is that all the way through this investigation, it was clear to me that if you understood the structure of the vacuum, the structure of the foundation of creation, you could reproduce it in a technology which creates a resonance pattern between the geometry of space, the geometry of the structure of the vacuum, and the technology itself. And if you could create that resonance link, all of a sudden you would download a huge amount of energy from the vacuum itself. You'd build a mini black hole. And to build such a mini black hole, you'd probably need crystals, because crystals appropriately cut and appropriately resonated would be the perfect material to make that link, since crystals molecules, first of all, crystals are 70% water, and then the crystal molecules are actually tetrahedral. The crystal molecules are very coherent if you have good crystals, and if they were cut in the appropriate geometry of the 64 tetrahedron grid with the right gases involved, you could create those dynamics. Because of my studies of the sun gods, you know, and because of my studies about the dynamic of ancient civilization, I had a really strong feeling that those crystals, and I'm going to tell you what it looks like right now, it's 64 tetrahedron grid inside a crystal ball. They're very small tetrahedron, and they're inside a crystal ball, and there's gases inside that ball. Okay, this is not some esoteric New Age crystal. Okay, this is highly technical, technological stuff. Okay, it's not like a raw crystal you grab from a mountain and start meditating with. Okay, now when I believe that many of the New Age people remember the powers of the crystals because they remember that technology. Okay, the first person that talked about Atlantis was not some psychic. The first person that talked about Atlantis was Plato. Plato is and was extremely respected. And we used most of Plato's stuff except the 3 books that he wrote about Atlantis. And when he wrote these books, in all of them he mentions that this is not some story, this is factual. And he says he got it from the high priest in Egypt. And he describes a very advanced civilization that has a source of power, which is later as well described by Edgar Cayce, has a source of power that they call a crystal of extreme luminosity, of extreme power. I believe that is the crystal that can be built, the crystal of Atlantis, to create a link to the geometry of space. Do you guys all follow this? I was starting to read the Bible, and you know, I was finding these plates of the description of God, and you know, with it came words like the throne of God was the crystal seat, you know, da 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 da. Many references to crystal. Ezekiel in the Bible, the story of Ezekiel. Enoch, which is not a book of the Bible. The book of Enoch was found in Ethiopia. Was never re-edited. It's translated directly from the original text. In both these accounts, they describe some kind of ship that shows up in a big cloud. And then they say a door opened and God called me onto his boat. And then inside it describes a crystal, it describes the throne of God as crystals with rainbows all around it. You see? I think he was describing the power, the drive of that ship. So I was really intrigued. So I started to read the Bible, and as I read the Bible, I realized something. I realized something I had never noticed before. That is, that most of the Bible is describing, the Old Testament is describing I'm going to have to read, and I can't hold this while I'm reading. Thank you. Appreciate it. So that the Bible actually is describing something, the Old Testament anyway, is describing something that is very, very strange. When the Old Testament talks about God, it doesn't say, and God. It says, and the Ark of the Covenant of God. It turns out that the whole Old Testament is describing the comings and going of the Ark of the Covenant, except for Genesis, which describes the start. But you see, even when you read Genesis in the context of what we saw today, you find that actually it's describing something very similar to the account of Atlantis given by Plato. A civilization that develops with a very advanced technology and that allows them to live very, very long. In the Bible, there's chapters after chapters describing people living 600 and 800 years. Okay? And then eventually that society was flooded, which is what Plato said happened to Atlantis. So actually Genesis could be an account of Atlantis. I thought that was interesting. And so I started to study it more and more. And I realized that the temples of Solomon was built for only one purpose: to host the Ark of the Covenant of God at its center, the Holy of Holy, the power of all power, the Ark. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I didn't think that the Judaic tradition was about some object that they called the seat of God. So I was looking into it and I was reading, and I thought, well, that's interesting, because in Genesis it talks about the tree of knowledge. You know, Adam and Eve, and the tree of knowledge, and the apple, and so on. Well, interestingly, if you cut an apple in half, you get a double torus with a seed in the middle, which contains the possibility for a whole other apple tree, right? The singularity, which has apples and singularities and apples and singularities and so on. So I was reading that, and then I realized as well, this text, when this is in Genesis, it's 4:24. When man began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, plural, sons of God, saw that the daughters of man were beautiful, and they married them, any of them, and they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. That means they were not from the earth. Okay? And also afterwards. And the sons of God went to the daughter of man and had children with them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So, this describes the sons of God that came to the earth, so they were not from the earth, and had children with the women of the earth. And I started to realize, wait a minute, was this planetary system seeded? You know, it started to, in anthropology, we're missing a huge link between the ancient Neanderthal and so on, and the modern Homo sapien. And that link we're missing is getting wider and wider, more and more records we get. There's new skulls that have been discovered now that makes that link even harder to make. So I started to think about it, and I'm like, that's interesting. And so I continued to read. And then I got across something really that perked my ears. It was in crossing of the sea. Exodus, that's 13:22. By day the Lord went ahead of them. This is Moses going towards the Red Sea as he's escaping Egypt with all of the tribes of Israel. Moses was son of Pharaoh for 40 years before he realized he was Jew and decided to take the tribes of Israel out of Egypt.
Another 40 years in the middle.
Yeah.
40 years of Prince, 40 years in the desert, then at 80 he decided.
Yeah. But when he decided he was going to go and with the tribes of Israel, he was leaving, and all of a sudden the Pharaoh changed his mind and went after him. Well, I was reading this. Now, when the Pharaoh weren't going to let him go, there was this whole thing where Moses and the other high priest of Egypt were having like a battle of manifestation. The ones that could manifest the wildest, craziest things was going to win. So like they had like frogs raining from the sky. He threw his staff down and it turned into a snake. He got water, he got blood to flow through the city and all this stuff. But he won that contest. as I looked at the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible, the Ark that they call the Ark of God, they give dimensions of that box. It's like a box-like object that's got gold on the outside, wood in the middle, and gold on the inside. Well, that's a capacitor. A capacitor is an object that holds energy. When you charge it, just like a battery, it holds energy, except that a battery can only discharge the energy very slowly. A capacitor can discharge the energy in an instant. So when I looked at it, I thought, well, that's a neat capacitor. It would be quite large in capacitance. It would be a very high level, a lot of capacitance. It would have really high voltage, and it would be quite heavy. It would be a heavy object, extremely heavy. In fact, it would be way too heavy to lift up with two flimsy poles. It would weigh over 3 tons because of all the gold on it. And so there was problems with that, but I noticed that the dimensions that were given in the Bible for that box matched the dimensions of a box that was found in the remains of King Tut in Egypt. And then I noticed that those boxes were the exact appropriate boxes to fit inside the sarcophagus inside the Grand Pyramid of Giza. Meaning that the box size is a perfect fit so that you can lower the ark inside the sarcophagus, inside the Grand Pyramid, and then push the poles in without having to touch the capacitor, which would zap the crap out of you. So when you look at, and then I noticed as well that the outside dimensions of the sarcophagus are exactly half, actually are twice the volume of the inside dimension. Exactly. Okay, so it's a perfect octave. And then if you measure the ark as described in the Bible, that's again twice smaller than the inside dimension of the sarcophagus. So now you have another octave. And then if you measure the inside volume of the ark as described in the Bible, you got another octave. It's again twice as big, twice as small. So it was a perfect fit. And I started to think, what would you want to carry in a capacitor like that? There must have been some extremely powerful energy source, energy device inside that capacitor. But the thing is that Moses supposedly didn't build that capacitor, didn't build that device until he was on the other side of Mount Sinai, on the other side of the Red Sea at Mount Sinai. When you read the Bible, you find that actually the Ark of the Covenant is always portrayed as a very, as this box-like object with its two poles, with some kind of extremely luminous object between the cherubim on top of it. And then you see that in the Bible, this object is always described with a huge, what they call pillar of cloud or pillar of light above it, a huge vortex. I had just finished elaborating the mathematics and the topology of the space-time manifold generating huge vortex at the north and south pole of those black holes. And if you were to build a small one, you would generate a vortex like that as well. So I thought that was interesting, but I didn't really have anything on it. And then I read something that boggled my mind. This is the crossing of the Red Sea. Moses is now going towards the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh has changed his mind and is going after him. Maybe the Pharaoh changed his mind and went after him because Moses left with something the Pharaoh didn't expect Moses was going to leave with. And here it says, on the way to the Red Sea, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and at night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. But you see, that pillar of fire and that pillar of cloud is always described on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Yet, here, they're not supposed to have the Ark of the Covenant yet. You see what I mean? So now I'm going, wait a minute. The box-like object that they're describing in the Bible might just be the carrying case for the power supply, which is something completely different, that generates the vortices and the singularity at the center. So I was starting to read this, and I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting, and I'm reading more, and it's saying that there's clouds above and there's clouds below and so on. And I thought, what do they mean by God? Right? Because they're calling it the Ark of the Covenant of God. So I did some research on that. Where is the word God coming from? What is this thing they call God? It's some kind of object. Okay? But what is this thing they're calling God? So I looked it up. And I looked everywhere and I couldn't find it. And finally, I found it in the preface of my Bible. Look in the preface of your Bible, and it will say where the word God was translated from. The word God was translated from the word tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton. Oh my God. That freaked me out. Oh my tetragrammaton, yes. That freaked me out. Every time you read the word God in the Bible, you can translate it to tetragrammaton. And so I was looking at the root etymology of the word tetragrammaton. It's like, oh my God, how can I find a word so close to tetrahedron in the Bible? And I looked at the etymology, and it turns out that tetra, which is four, right, was used for, and grammaton has a root word that can be grammar. So four grammar, or four letters, are taught to be Yahweh, the four letters of God. Yeah, Yutevoti. However, when you dig a little deeper in the etymology of the word grammaton, it has actually a deeper root. And that root is for tetra, tetra, which is tetrahedron. Grammaton comes from the word gram, or gravity. weight, it refers to weight, gram, and the effect of gravity. And that's where the word gravity came from, grammaton. So now you have a word for God, okay, that has the structure of a tetrahedron generating a gravitational effect. And I thought, well, that I'm pushing it, right? I'm sure, this is kind of wild. But hey, then I look up what the heck is the tetragrammaton in Kabbalistic tradition. And I found that it is an isotropic vector metric in 2D. Here is typically in Kabbalistic tradition the way God is represented. It's represented as isotropic vector metric. Remember, 4 faces, 3, 2, 1. It's like one face of the isotropic vector metric. And each letters of the word God has a number that goes with it. In Kabbalistic tradition, that's very important. Now you got to realize that the Kabbalistic tradition are the oral tradition of the Druidic history. These traditions were not to be written. They were not even supposed to be talked about. Only initiates could learn about these knowledge. It was thought to be the nature of God that was revealed. And if you understood it, you could understand God. So I was thinking maybe the Kabbalistic tradition is the explanation of what the power source inside that box is. That bright object. Go ahead.
I want to also mention I'm a student of Kabbalah. And,
yes.
Yud means singularity.
That's right. At the center of the Kabbalistic tradition is that crown that unfolds onto itself to infinity, describing singularity. So I was puzzled with this. I found that the tetragrammaton, right, was actually generating the numbers. So each letter in the isotropic vector matrix is a number. And the Kabbalistic tradition tells you that the numbers are just as important as the letters. And so when you calculate the numbers, you get 72, which is the 72 names of God that's found in the Bible, or the 72 faces of God, right? So that all match. But this is a male God. We're missing half the equation again. Why is it that in many of these ancient civilizations, some of them we didn't have time to see today, we only have half of the code? Well, that would be because if you were an advanced civilization trying to put a code, embed a code in a not so advanced planetary system, you wouldn't want these people to be able to uncode or decode that code prior to being ready for that type of power. So you could code the code, or you could make the code only one polarity of it, like the male polarity of the code. And it wouldn't be until that civilization understood the balance between the male and female, understood the equality between the male and female, that they would be able to decode the code. And then that would mean that they were ready to do it. You guys follow what I just said? So basically, here you have to add the female god or goddess to the tetrahedron or to the isotropic vector metric. And if you did, you have the double of these numbers. And the result would be 72 plus 72, given 144, which is thought to be the number of ascension in the in Revelation. As well, in Revelation it says that the New Jerusalem is a crystal city with rainbows all around it. And that crystal city has faces of 144. There is exactly 144 faces on the outside of a 64 tetrahedron metric. Nice. I thought I was onto it. And so I kept on reading the Bible, and I got really interested now, you know. And I'm like, oh my God, this is all about the technology. This is all about Atlantis. And I kept on reading, and I found something that was extremely significant. And this has been completely omitted by scholars. This is long after, you know, Moses was following the ark through the desert. It took him 40 years to do a route that usually took only a year. Okay? I know this because my father, actually my grandfather, my father is Iranian, and my grandfather was a guide that brought people to Mecca from Iran. And it took him 6 months there and 6 months back in the desert. And so these routes were well known. And actually, my grandfather lived to the age of 128. And I believe that it's because he went to Mecca, to the Kaaba, which held the black crystal, the dark stone, or the black sun, as described by the Sumerian plates, given to man by the sun gods. But in any case, Moses is taking 40 years to do a route that should have taken a year. Why? Because he's following the ark. It's very clear in the Judaic tradition and in the rabbinic tradition that the ark is moving on its own. Whenever the ark lifts and starts going, they would lift camp and follow it. And whenever the ark would stop, they would stop and put a camp up. Sometimes they would stay there for 3-4 years before the ark would start going again. So this ark seemed to have anti-gravitic capability. It seemed to be able to hover. There's instances where they describe the ark lifting the high priest that carried it. So I'm thinking about all this, and then eventually, you know, Moses dies, and Joshua has taken the lead, and Joshua arrives at the Jordan, and this is where I found this really interesting thing. Joshua arrives at the Jordan, and the Jordan is running at flood level. There's no way they can cross with the tribes of Israel. They're trying to get to Jericho on the other side. So Joshua doesn't know what to do, and he asks God. And God says, Now, this is describing the high priest taking the ark and going into the water of the Jordan with the ark. And as soon as they put their feet in the Jordan with the ark, the waters are cut up. Okay? And then it says, you know, and then there's a whole bunch of other things. This is Joshua 4:22 for people that want to refer it. And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner they had set their feet on dry ground than the water of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. So they went into the Jordan, sat there with the ark, while all of the tribes of Israel went across, and the water was stopped. And then as soon as they got out, the water started to flow again. Well, I thought that's interesting, because one evidence of gravitational effect would be to stop the course of water. But what blew my mind is what comes next, at the end of that chapter. For the Lord your God, they're talking about the ark, dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what had been done to the Red Sea when he dried up before us, when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. Wow. That has been omitted. Because this says that they used the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to open the Red Sea with Moses. But in the section where they talk about opening the Red Sea, they just say Moses lift up his staff and open his arm, and the Red Sea opened. They forgot to mention that the ark was involved with this staff. And so here they do, though. Here they make it very obvious that the power of the ark was used to open the Red Sea. That means the ark was not the box that was built at the foot of Mount Sinai after opening the Red Sea. The power of the ark had to be there with Moses before he crossed the Red Sea. And thus it was something else. The box was only something to carry it across the desert for 40 years. Probably he didn't have time to take the box out when he left Egypt. He just took the crystal. Go ahead.
Do you think Ethiopia has the Ark of the Covenant now?
I'm going to get to that. So, are you guys all following this?
Yes.
Okay. So I was really excited. I was like, oh my God, this is really real. I mean, they're really talking about some object. And this is kind of tough to do, but we can, I started to look into it, and I found more and more evidence that the ark was this crystalline structure. I found the Ezekiel text. I found the Keys of Enoch text, and I thought, wait a minute, what are they talking about? Well, I looked deeper into the Kabbalistic tradition, and when I did, I found that they didn't just give you like hints to what the geometry was. They actually said, this is the Kabbalistic tree, this is the foundation of all creation, and if you decode this, you'll understand all of the universe. So I knew there that they were giving us a really good key to what was powering the Ark of the Covenant, since the Ark was thought to be the seat of God, the seat of the universe. And the Kabbalistic tree can commonly be described as the tree of knowledge as well. The tree that was placed in the Garden of Eden at the center of our Genesis. So when I looked at it, I thought, what is this? And I started to read Kabbalistic tradition texts and all this. Oh my God, I got so confused. It was so confusing. There's so much stuff out there, and it's all philosophy. And I was really kind of not being able to find anything that was jiving, but I was looking at the geometry, and what I did is I plastered it on the ceiling of my van so I could lay in my bed and look at it in the morning, every morning. And I was trying to decode it. And really quickly, I realized that the bottom part was a tetrahedron. And that the top part was an octahedron. But I didn't know what this middle part was. This X with a box around it. I didn't know how to deal with that. And then I realized, wait a minute, this box here, this rectangle, fits in this upper rectangle. So I thought, oh, maybe they just took it and squashed it. So I took the top part and slid the bottom into it. And boom, the result was a tetrahedron and an octahedron on top, which is all of the vertices you need to generate the star tetrahedron with the octahedron in the middle. You guys see this? To generate this, all you need is a tetrahedron and an octahedron and all the vertices, and you can start building it. So I was like, oh, this is cool. As soon as you slide the bottom into the top, basically, as soon as you compress it, as soon as you collapse it, right, you obtain a 3D geometry. And then I realized that the Kabbalistic text said that there wasn't just one tree, but that there's four, and that they're attached at the crown, or at the root. Well, I assumed that they were giving us only half the code again, so that there would be 8 trees attached at the root. Well, if there is 8 trees attached at the root, and each one are decoded to give a star tetrahedron, as we just did, then the result is 64 tetrahedron grid. How do you know you've decoded it right? Well, when you're finished, you can actually plot the 2-dimensional tree right on top of it, and you have all the lines you need with its sephiroths. The sephiroths are these balls on the corner of the tree. The word sephiroth comes from the word sapphire, referring to crystals. And when you plot the sephiroth all around the tree, all around the 64 tetrahedron, since each tree has one sephiroth involved in the middle, each tree only has 9 sephiroths. 9 multiplied by 8, 72. I had come back exactly to the tetragrammaton.
You've got
And
2 other ways that you can do this.
Mhm.
The top 3 are always considered to be separate and above man, and thus to be mapped separately.
Mhm.
Center, the center and the crown, is in its own space, and the one space that's missing, that you have filled in with your dark circle, is da'at, known as knowledge.
Knowledge, that's right. That point, that's the esoteric sephiroth in the middle. That's right. I have shown this to rabbinic tradition experts, and one of them started crying. It's very significant. What scared me is when I was studying this, it warned over and over in many books that if you try to decode the Kabbalistic tree, most people turn crazy. They lose it. And I figure, well, you know what? I'm already crazy, so I can't go much further, so I should be all right, right? And so I just went at it, and it came out. So I was like in amazement that it was so easy. Now I did do an animation that So here it is, again.
In this animation, we see the Kabbalistic trees coming together under the genero-active contracting pulses, creating the 64 tetrahedrons of the geometry of space, forming the vector equilibrium at its center.
Thank you, Amber. And here's a Kabbalistic tree that was generated during the time that I was writing this up in a little journal I published. This was in England. But note on this little animation that when we look at it slowly, you can see. Can everybody see here how the tree actually compresses and becomes a 3D object? This is the contractive side of the event horizon, you see? And then when you're done, can you see how all the sephirots intersect all of, it gives you the exact correct geometry, giving you the 64 tetrahedron grid and the vector equilibrium in the middle. And that's just fantastic. That's just fantastic. I was just mind blown. And so you can see that in the Bible, that all of the ancient knowledge of the Old Testament of the Bible is describing this technology, is describing this power. A crystal full of eyes, right? A crystal full of eyes, as described by Ezekiel, looks like this. Yeah. The petals of the intersecting field of each tetrahedron generating singularity generates eyes-like structure, and certainly would generate a lot of radiance and a lot of rainbows if it's a mini black hole. And so I was looking at it, and I started to trace back the movements of the ark. And because we're running out of time, I'm not going to go into too many details on that. But the ark seemed to have moved from one place to the other, and every time it would move from one place to the other, the symbol of the star of tetrahedron, the Star of David, would change name. For instance, the ark went to Zion. The star tetrahedron was called the Star of Zion. Then the ark went to Solomon. The star tetrahedron was called the Shield of Solomon. Then the ark went to David, and the star tetrahedron was called the Star of David. So you could actually map the geometry directly to the movements of the ark. So you knew that the geometry was directly related to the ark. And so I started to see more and more evidence of it. And I looked in the Bible further and further, and I saw that they actually brought the ark to the Temple of Solomon, and then they built a huge water container in the back of the Holy of Holies. It was called the Little Sea because it was so big. And they would charge the water with the ark. You see? And so I was very excited. I was like, because then I realized that all of the pyramids in Egypt, including the pyramids in South America and Mexico, had waterways that were diverted to go through it. All the pyramids of Egypt had waterways going from the Nile into the pyramid. So they were charging the water with the ark, and then they would allow the water to be used in the fields, and they would get incredible crops. And that's what eventually started baptism with that water, holy waters, and so on. and incredible crops. Every year at Yom Kippur, the ark would be taken out of the Temple of Solomon and brought to the waters that they would irrigate the fields with for the rest of the year. Imagine a technology that creates a huge amount of coherency in the vacuum state polarization, in the structure of space-time around it. Any material that's around there, and certainly water, because water is so malleable, would take that imprint, would go into high coherence, and start to be able to download much more life force than originally. So I started to, I could see how this whole evolution. So I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to give you, do you guys all follow this? Yeah. See, this is really like a step in a new understanding of what truly happened on Earth.